Welcome back. Today we are talking with Regina Phelps. Regina, lots of interesting information in the first two segments. Now we're going to kind of change gears a little bit, but it's still relevant to us and something we still need to consider.
Yeah. This one I think is really fascinating, and it really ties to, if you remember, the second most important risk on the global risk report was disinformation and misinformation. And that really ties to what 2024 is. And I don't know if your listeners are aware of this, but at the end of last year, there were quite a few publications that began to talk about how unusual 2024 is going to be, because literally the world is voting. It's the biggest election year ever in the history of the globe, of the number of people that are actually going to be eligible to vote in some place around the world. And so why that's important is, of course, that has a huge impact on everybody's individual lives in the countries that they live in, but also has a huge impact from a business perspective, because we have a supply chain that's globally intertwined. And so what happens in one country has a huge impact on another. There's all of these issues related to disinformation and misinformation and the use of AI, and how this is going to be a huge issue globally in an election. Some individuals might be consuming media that are not as sophisticated as others, and they might be passing along things that are obviously even a fake, but they pass it along anyway. So the ability to influence politics and information, to destabilize countries or regions, is really, really high. And so, again, does this have to do with business continuity and resiliency and crisis management? And I will say to you, in my world, yes, it does. We have done so many exercises on the issues about a Taiwan embargo, or what happens if China invades Taiwan, or what about how to de-risk China, or how to deal with what's going on with the Israeli-Hamas war. I would have never thought in my 40 years of practice, I would have spent so much time focused on these huge global, what seem to be kind of regional issues, but they are hugely important and could have a gigantic impact on the world. And this really starts with how people vote. And of course, we have a big election here in the United States in 2024. So I want to go through what was a study that was done in The Economist. And I would highly, and you'll see the references to it. It was a November issue of The Economist. I think you can actually, if you register at The Economist, you can get one article or two without having to go get to their paywall. This is a really great study to read. I would encourage all of you to take a look at it. So 2024 has been talked about not just by The Economist, but by every publication that I read, like the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times and the Washington Post and Reuters and Bloomberg and blah, 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 as the year of the election globally. And there's never been as many people voting. So there are at least 64 countries, plus the European Union, that are all going to the polls this year. That's huge. It's 49% of the world are going to vote this year. So that has, and as you were just mentioning earlier, Canada could call an election, right? Even though you're supposed to have an election in 2025. So you might be jumping into this boat with the rest of us. And whenever you have elections, of course, there's always instability. Certainly here in the United States, people are on pins and needles. One other thing I've been planning for with many of my clients is what happens if you have insurrections, what happens if you have major disruptions of politics, and you have huge issues related to not a major civil war, but more localized sort of events, the assassination of judges, the assassination of political characters, what that would mean. And I never ever thought I'd be doing that. But we're spending a lot of time thinking about that stuff. And so the election issue is a big deal for our work. Or do people talk about that? Is it just this weird United States people that talk about this stuff? Are you talking about this kind of thing in Canada?
I think people are just, we want to change. That's really the biggest thing. Most people are saying we want to change, somebody different, or because in Canada, I know you can have two terms in the US, and that's what, 8 years?
Right.
8 years. In Canada, after about the fifth, sixth year, no matter who's in power, people want to change.
People are tired.
Yeah, and we've gone through the pandemic now with the same leader.
Right.
We've come out of that with the same leader. So regardless, anybody would, just change the leader now. We want
Right.
something different. And I
Right.
think that's where people are here.
Well, it's interesting. I think when you and I talked about the impacts of the pandemic last year on numerous occasions, one of the things is it really political disruptions, because the pandemic is very disruptive to everybody that was, of course, living in it. And you always blame your leaders, and it's very hard for leaders to survive a pandemic because of the feelings that people have at the end of it.
Hmm.
And they blame a leader, even though the leader generally can't necessarily do a lot to improve it or make it better in the short term. So yeah, that doesn't surprise me. I'm not surprised about that. So this is where the Economist article comes into play. And you'll see in the top left-hand corner, it's the name of the article. It's the date of the publication, which is November 13th. This was developed by what's called the Economist Intellectual Unit. There's some great visuals in here, which I think would be helpful for all of our listeners to, if you have the opportunity to see this on YouTube, you may appreciate that. What you'll see is there's a bunch of bubbles here on the page, and everything that you see, these are all the countries that are voting in 2024. Canada's not there yet, but it might come and join the party with all of us. It's over 4 billion people that are going to be voting this year around the world. And so again, think of all that disinformation, misinformation. Oh my God. So there's a lot of opportunity for things to go awry. And these are some really big countries. India, now the largest country in the world, they actually surpassed China. The United States, Brazil, Indonesia, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Russia. Of course, that's not very democratic, but they're having an election anyway. And then a bunch of other countries. And I want to peel this back a little bit more, but this just gives you an idea. The other big bubble, by the way, if you're looking at this on YouTube, that's to the left, that's gray, is China, the other big bubble, which used to be bigger than India, but India actually surpassed it last year.
Mm-hmm.
So as we know, just because we're having an election doesn't mean that it's free and fair, right? I mean, people have elections all the time. Look at Russia. I mean, there could be 5 people running against Putin. It won't make any difference. It's a show. And what they've done is they've called out in this particular slide some of the places where it's very likely it really doesn't matter. We know who's going to win. And the big ones they call out is Russia. We, of course, would assume that with Putin, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Mexico, and Turkey. It's amazing to me that Turkey's in the EU. That's the part I've never quite figured out, because Erdogan is such a dictator and is closely aligned with Putin. But yeah, he's in the EU, which is probably too bad. But there are, again, these countries that it doesn't really matter. You know who's going to win simply because of the nature of the organization. Now, there's as I mentioned, who actually did all the deep dive in this is what the Economist says is their sister organization, which is the Economic International, Intelligence Unit, Economic Intelligence Unit. And they basically have graded democracies. And one of the things that if you're in the United States and you're looking at this, I want you to look at the colors of this particular slide. Because what you'll see is that the United States actually used to be a dark red color. I bet Canada is in that dark red color. On the far left-hand side, or far right-hand side of the slide. The United States used to be that color. But our democracy has really began to unravel starting in 2016, with a lot of things that began to shift and change. When that began to occur, the United States was no longer graded by other organizations as a full-fledged democracy. It's still a democracy, but now it has flaws, recognized flaws. India is in that same category, Brazil, and a variety of other smaller countries. And then what you'll see when you look at the slide is it does grade it between authoritarian as either black or very gray, really a tomatoey orangey red, which means fully democratic, and then it goes into a kind of a hybrid in the middle. So you'll see like Turkey and Pakistan is kind of somebody that's in the middle. Now, why this is important for you to understand, just generally speaking, is that many of us in the world of resiliency, crisis management, supply chains, buy things from all these countries. And whatever happens politically could impact us in those industries that we're closely affiliated with, like Brazil, like Mexico. Those in particular, when I look at, those are places that people buy a lot of things from. And there's a lot of those smaller dots are also big suppliers. So you should be very aware as a resiliency professional where the countries are that you have this exposure. There's an election. Are they having an election this year? What could that mean to the supply chain? Could there be disruptions? Could they stop transit? Could they actually limit what's shipped out of a factory? All those things are going to be your concern this year, and it's going to have to be about politics. And you're not going to be thinking like, wow, really? Yes, it has to do with what we do for a living. The most democratic nation still is Britain, interestingly enough. When they actually have actually done the research of the characteristics of a democracy, they still win the prize as the darkest red of all of them. Russia is the worst. Not a big surprise, of course. Really sad for poor Russians and the impacts that country has on all the people around them, and certainly what we've seen in Ukraine. It's just been completely tragic. For countries like the United States and India, which is considered a democracy with flaws, very big elections this year. They're hoping, and the economists, as they evaluated the elections, they're hoping they're going to be free and fair. Fingers crossed. But because there is less participation generally, people don't go out to vote in large numbers in the United States as they do in many other countries. And there's governance-related issues. We have some weaknesses, just like India does as well. And then places like Brazil and Turkey are not having national elections, but they're having tons of regional elections, municipal elections. And so those could have a big impact, like in Istanbul or in the national capital or places like Rio or Sao Paulo in Brazil. So those could have an impact if you have work in those particular areas. And so that's another thing to keep in the back of your mind as well. And then the EU is voting. So throw that into the hopper, and there's that many more organizations or countries within the our electorate here. They're going to be voting this year as they establish their new parliament for the EU. So a lot happening. More people are going to vote in 2024 than in any previous year ever in the world. That's really quite remarkable. And so this doesn't mean that there's an explosion of democracy, but it means a lot of people are voting. Mm-hmm. And so that's an important thing. I mean, fingers crossed is not the way to look at this, but hopefully we're going to see at least some fair elections and well supervised and appropriate in as many places as possible. But you can see from the map that's in front of you, the dark gray areas and all the yellow areas are less democratic. And even as you go to the right of that, the more orangey ones versus the dark red are still democracies with flaws. I want to talk just briefly about the first election of consequence that happened already this year, and that's Taiwan. Taiwan, of course, I follow closely because I've been doing a ton of work related to Taiwan for the last 2 years, 3 years actually, based on China and the saber rattling that they've had for the last 3 years. On January 13th, Li Jinping was actually elected president. He was the vice president for the previous administration from the DPP. This is a progressive party, and they are very interested in keeping their distance from China. So how to deal with China, not to become usurped by China, was a huge part of their election. And they won. Now, they did not win the parliament. It's going to have to be a shared government on the parliament, but they won with very strong results, the presidency. But China has already thrown down the gauntlet, saying anybody that congratulates them publicly will be rebuked because they do not acknowledge or agree with this election, because this election does not support China in any way. I want to remind all of our listeners where a large number of chips in the world are made. Let me just go back here for a second. Whoops. 60% of all the chips in the world are made in Taiwan, and 90% of all of the high-end chips are made in Taiwan. You may not care much about a little piece of dirt that's off the coast of China, but I'll tell you, If China invades Taiwan, we're going to care, and the world will grind to a halt.
We've got 1 minute left.
Yeah, so it takes more than having fingers crossed to get through this election. And what I'm asking all of you, wherever you happen to be in the universe, we all have the opportunity to save democracy wherever you live. Vote, 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 vote. Let your voice be heard through nonviolent protest. I want to emphasize nonviolent. Connect with others and get involved in local races. Show support for your election officials. People in the United States are being terrorized that are people that work in polls. That's insane. Get information from credible sources. Don't read Facebook. My God.
Yeah.
Pick up a newspaper, find a legitimate source of information. And lastly, I ask that people respect others. We all are in this together. Sometimes I think people forget that we're all in this together, but we really need to be aware of that as we go forward. So on that note, did I actually make it in time?
We did. We've come to the end of the show. Regina, thank you so much. There's a lot for people to really consider here, and I hope they do. And all the elections that you pointed out, that is going to have an impact on what we do, because the ramifications or the repercussions and the outcomes of these elections could impact where we are. And it doesn't matter if it's on the other side of the world.
Right.
COVID started on the other side of the world. Look what happened.
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
You're
really
welcome.
Appreciate sharing your time again, and everyone watching and listening. Stay prepared, everybody. If you liked that video, thumbs up. If you didn't like that video, thumbs down. But leave me a message and let me know your thoughts. Of course, don't forget to subscribe. And in the meantime, stay prepared, everybody.